Today is Wednesday, March 12th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. President Trump issues a threat to Iran. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating on your podcast platform of choice. We'd appreciate that. You could also email us as well if you want to get right to our inbox there. It's quickstartpodcast@cbn.org. We'd love to hear from you. We're all here getting through all the news of the day that's going on. We're here each and every weekday, bright and early, and glad you're here with us. And with me today, Trey Goins-Phillips from CBN, and we got a lot to get to, Trey, including on the focus story. Some athletes are kind of firing back at Nike for one of their big ads that recently ran.
Yeah, so it was Nike's first time being in the Super Bowl in more than, a quarter of a century. And now female athletes are targeting them for, quote, ignoring the real problem that women are facing in athletics.
All right, looking forward to the detail. Have they really not been in there for a quarter of a century, Nike?
Yeah, 27 years since
Really?
Nike did a Super Bowl commercial.
I wouldn't have guessed that. I would not have guessed that.
I was surprised.
That's interesting. All right, well, we'll get to more details on that in the focus story. Looking forward to that. On the main thing, who are the true pioneers of sharing the gospel in professional sports? Trey, you had an interesting conversation on this. You're all into sports today, and you're not the sports guy.
I know. It's a big sports day for me. It'll probably be my biggest sports day of the year. But this conversation really was fascinating, talking about some of the origins of athletes sharing their faith publicly.
All right, looking forward to that conversation on the main thing. And the news in 90 is coming up next, right after this.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem, and the city is restless. The people of Israel welcome Jesus as king, his followers ready for revolution. But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees! How will you escape being condemned to hell?
Experience Holy Week like never before.
What have you done?
Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen, Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
All right, it's time for the news in 90 seconds. The UN Security Council is set to hold an emergency meeting today as Iran's nuclear stockpile nears weapons-grade levels, and President Trump has drawn a red line warning Iran that if it pursues a nuclear weapon, military action will follow. Trump recently sent a letter to Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, urging negotiations on a new nuclear deal. They initially rejected the offer, accusing Trump of seeking to impose new demands. However, they later signaled a possible willingness to discuss concerns about the militarization of its nuclear program. Trump warned that Iran is running out of time, stating that something is going to happen one way or another. The IAEA reports that Iran's uranium enrichment has reached 60% purity. That's dangerously close to weapons grade, with enough material for up to 6 bombs. And the U.S. will resume sharing intelligence with Ukraine after successful negotiations in Saudi Arabia led Ukraine to accept Washington's proposal for an immediate 30-day ceasefire. The agreement, however, now hinges on Moscow's willingness to accept the same terms. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories on that front over at cbnnews.com. And obviously, there are a lot of high-stakes interactions going on right now. It's really concerning that Iran has, in particular, gotten this far with their weapons grade. I think I was doing a live stream with, George Thomas. We were talking about this. And don't quote me on this. I'm ballparking it, but the gist of it is, I know, correct. The amount of progress they've made in the last 5 to 6 years it's really kind of scary, because they were only at, 6 or 7% purity, maybe in 2018, 2019, something like that. And now they're at 60% purity, and they're getting up to that level. I think it's around 85 or 90% purity is when you can really make it weapons grade. So yeah, they're getting way too close to this. And we know that Iran has openly stated, they've already kind of softened the ground for what they want to do when they sent these attacks at Israel already. They sent the the drones out there flying, and then they did another missile attack. So they've already openly attacked, right? Like it's not just proxies anymore. So them with nuclear weapons, I mean, I think we all know what they would do with it. And I don't think it's a stretch to think, I mean, the only possible way they wouldn't do it is if they were 100% sure that, you know, us or somebody else would absolutely flatten them into a parking lot in return. That's the only thing, mutually assured destruction, that would stop them from trying to wipe Israel off the map. But we know they want to do it.
Yeah, I think it's also a bit of a it's a precarious situation all around, right? Because you want to be diplomatic as much as you can, but how do you pursue diplomatic talks with a literal powder keg? I think that's also
with crazy people.
Right. I mean, that's difficult to do. And you're right that historically mutually assured destruction has been the one thing that can kind of bring other parties to the negotiation table if they know that the U.S. is serious about eliminating you if you were to do X, Y, and Z, whatever that is, in this case, attacking Israel. But also, you have to remember that they view this as a holy war. So it's like, do they see this as that's a net gain if they're completely eliminated? Right. So we're not dealing with the usual players that historically you would be dealing with in these kinds of negotiations. So the fact that this is so multifaceted and multi-layered, I think makes it that much more complex. But I do think a lot of it is the U.S. We've been kind of asleep at the wheel on this, right? I don't think that we've been taking Iran as seriously as we need to have been, and then you end up in this kind of a situation where you have Trump kind of trying to strong arm, Iran, which maybe that will work. Maybe that'll be effective. Maybe that's something that resonates with them. But then also maybe just upsets the powder keg that I was referring to. So you don't know. I think these things are kind of a tightrope balance.
Yeah. And, you look at a lot of the Shiite eschatology and the Mahdi and all this stuff. Like you said, you're not dealing with just normal people who are maybe normal world leaders who are kind of working for self-preservation. Like, no, they're looking at this from an apocalyptic sort of view. And perhaps then they don't care about attacking Israel because they think maybe this is going to usher in the end times or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, you're definitely dealing with a powder keg here. So, I mean, this is just, again, I love to put things on the table. We talk about the news. We cover it the best way we can, truthfully, but also so that you can be praying. I mean, these are things that there's not a lot you and I can do, right, about what's happening in Iran and how the U.S. interacts with Iran on a diplomatic level here, or on a conflict potentially between them. So what we can do is pray, though, and prayer is powerful. So ultimately, God's sovereign over all this. So that's the best action that we can take for the moment. So that's definitely one to be adding to our prayer list. So, all right, let's head over to the focus story now, and talking about that Nike ad from the Super Bowl, and which is news to me. I didn't realize they hadn't been out of the Super Bowl for so long. It's kind of crazy. But they had this ad, and tell me about the ad first.
Yeah, so the ad, which was, like we said at the top, the first Super Bowl ad that Nike has had in 27 years. It was titled So Win, and the commercial addressed perceived injustices that female athletes face, of course, from a secular perspective and from the perspective of a huge company like Nike, which is more progressive. But they said that women are, facing discrimination over the kinds of emotions that society accepts from them, over the athletic prowess that female athletes are allowed to show, juxtaposed against male athletes, and then over the crowd sizes even that they attract, and the following that women's basketball, for example, gets over the following that men's basketball gets. And the ad had phrases in it like, you can't flex, so flex. You can't fill a stadium, so fill a stadium. You can't be emotional, so be emotional. And then ultimately it ended with the title of the ad, you can't win, so win. It was juxtaposing, this is what society says about you as female athletes, and this is how you ought to respond. So that was kind of the tenor of the Nike ad itself.
And so who is behind this now response video?
So the ad itself was a 30-second ad from Nike and XXXY Athletics. They released a 1-minute video response that they've shared on their social media platforms. And if you didn't guess by the name XXXY Athletics, they're referring to male chromosomes, female chromosomes, because it's an apparel brand that's built with the goal of supporting specifically women's sports and keeping males, those who identify as transgender women, who are biological males from competing on female sports teams, which has become far more than any other issue that women may face in the athletic arena. That has become the biggest cause and the biggest threat that so many female athletes are now speaking out against. So this company that is an apparel brand launched this video response, kind of firing back at Nike for the fact that, you say you're for women with all of these things, seemingly addressing sexism, but they're kind of ignoring the elephant in the room, which is men encroaching on female spaces.
Yeah. And so what are they saying now, the athletes in these videos? What is kind of their response been to what Nike did?
Yeah, so there were several female athletes who participate in it, probably the biggest name being Riley Gaines. But one of the participants was Canadian powerlifter April Hutchinson. She actually was suspended for 2 years from the Canadian Powerlifting Union because she spoke out against a transgender identified man being permitted to enter into competitions in women's categories. She said in the video, "I've never been told that I can't flex or that I can't do this or can't do that." And then a University of Nevada women's volleyball captain, she spoke out similarly against her school's decision to compete against a transgender identified male. In the ad, she said that Nike ad kind of represented old feminism. "I don't think anyone is telling women in sports that they can't champion their sport." And then went on to say that they're ignoring, as I said a minute ago, they're ignoring kind of the elephant in the room, and then contrasting itself against Nike's ad. The XXXY video made several claims. It called out, quote, fake feminism, accused Nike of, quote, pretending to care about women, and condemned the brand for ignoring the real problem. At the end of the video, Riley Gaines, a 12-time NCAA All-American swimmer and known now for her advocacy for protecting women in women's sports, she said, "Just do it. That's your slogan, isn't it, Nike? Just do it. Stand up for women. It's the easiest thing in the world to do."
Yeah, I know. And it should be the easiest thing in the world to do. And I think maybe the pendulum's starting to potentially swing back on this culturally. I mean, even Gavin Newsom kind of is sort of, reading the tea leaves there, and he's taken a step back. So maybe we're going to see more of a groundswell culturally on this, because as we've said many times on this podcast, it's utterly ridiculous to just prioritize the feelings of this extreme minority, which again, like, I have sympathy for someone who has this mental illness that they think they're the wrong sex or whatever. But that doesn't mean you just bow down and just roll the red carpet out of society for somebody that's got a rare sort of condition. Like, you just don't do that, because it disregards the, if your priority, if your basis is someone's feelings, how do you disregard everyone else's feelings except this one person? Because it seems to be mostly in these scenarios, when I'm thinking of like high school sports, pretty rare, right? It makes news when there's somebody out there doing it. So it's happening. It's not that it's not happening. It's happening more and more. But I would imagine that most schools you're dealing with one or, very, very minimal amount of instances. All that to say is that the feelings of the rest of the people involved seem to be ignored, while the one gets prioritized. And then it's also ridiculous because it's a boy or a man going against women, which, again, how does that serve women? It doesn't serve women at all. You're buying into the mental illness and then going from there. And when you apply it to, they would never do it in any other way. If I said that I was 12 years old, in my mind, I have this mental delusion. I think I'm 12. I mean, it's the same logic though, right? Like, if I think I'm 12, you wouldn't then therefore let me go back into, 6th grade and then go play on all the middle school teams and stuff as a 49-year-old guy. You just wouldn't do it. But for some reason, we do it in this case. It's been incredibly bizarre to watch.
Yeah, I think making exceptions for the, overwhelming minority was one of the other central tenets. That was one of the other things that they were wanting to point out in this XXXY Athletics video response. Even the founder of the organization, the brand, Jennifer Say, she's a former U.S. gymnast, and like I said, now the founder of this company. She called out Nike directly and said, "You're so full of it. The only thing female athletes are told they can't do is stand up for the integrity of their sports, for keeping men out of women's sports. Literally, that's the only thing that they are unable to do." Again, the name of the video was "You Can't Speak, So Speak." It was saying we are able to actually do all of the things in the Nike ad that you said women are discouraged from doing. The one thing we can't do is speak up to defend ourselves.
Yeah, maybe they were trying to pump themselves up. We need to speak out against all of these transgender individuals who are dominating women's sports, because it is ironic. That's an interesting way to look at it, that they are not willing to speak out on this particular issue, and that's all you have to do. And it does show like a lack of courage or a complete ideologue mentality that's overtaken Nike. So yeah, super interesting ad there. I'm glad they're doing it and pushing this narrative, because it is the winning argument. It is the right position. I mean, I think as Christians, we could recognize this as being the biblical position as well, even though it's not obviously specifically addressed in Scripture. But we've all talked about how Scripture clearly identifies two genders and the differences in those genders and whatnot. So, but appreciate you bringing that one to the podcast today, Trey. And who were the spiritual pioneers of sharing the gospel as professional athletes? Well, Trey has a fascinating conversation coming up on The Main Thing, and the answer coming up in 30 seconds.
Let me tell you, the God's gonna cut you.
It's Holy Week in Jerusalem. Crowds welcome Jesus as king. Rebellion is in the air.
Jesus operates outside our jurisdiction.
Rome will descend on us all.
But instead of taking the throne, Jesus turns the tables.
My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of thieves.
The world will never be the same. Coming soon to theaters, The Chosen Last Supper. Get your tickets now.
All right, it's time for The Main Thing now. And sports reporter and author Matt Seeger joined Trey to tell his own incredible conversion story and chronicle the Major League Baseball players of the 1970s, who were, as he calls them, the spiritual pioneers of sharing the gospel as professional athletes. I mean, if you think about that time and then professional sports, I mean, that's kind of crazy that sharing the gospel is happening at all in that scenario. So considering that context and more, this conversation on today's Main Thing is one you won't want to miss.
You're the author of this book, The God Squad, the born-again San Francisco Giants of 1978. You've spent years studying this, compiling this information. You're also a sports reporter. You were actually saved and became a born-again believer the same year as the subject matter of your book in 1978. So talk a little bit about your own conversion to Christianity.
I'm Jewish. Both my parents are Jewish. I was not raised religiously Jewish, but culturally I knew I was a Jew. One thing I knew as a Jew was we don't believe in Jesus. But when I got to graduate school at Syracuse University to study magazine journalism, I got very sick. I went to the clinic. I got a doctor named Indira Koshi, who was a believer, and shared with me just a little bit about that there was a God who loved me, and then my name was in the New Testament, Matthew, and she showed me the Gospel of Matthew, gave me a little New Testament, and I read it a bit, but I got well and kind of put it aside. But a few years later, I began to get drawn again into reading the Bible I had gone through some personal difficulties, and now I was turning back, looking to see if there was a God. And one night, I was at my home. I was talking to a Jewish friend of mine named Carol. It was around 10 at night. And I said to Carol, Carol, I'm beginning to believe in God as I read the Bible. I said, also, for one thing, sometimes things happen I can't explain. Like, for example, I'll be thinking about a person I haven't seen in a long time and the phone will ring and it'll be them. I just use that as an example of, things I couldn't explain. But I said, as a Jew, I don't see how I could believe in Jesus. Right after I said that, the phone rang. It's like 10 o'clock at night. I looked at Carol. I said, oh, it's probably God calling, one of those strange phone calls. I picked it up. The guy on the other end says, is Lisa there? I said, no, she moved. Thought he'd hang up. He said, well, she borrowed a book from me. I'm trying to get it back. Oh, I don't see any books here. Sorry, gotta go. He kept talking. He says, well, the other reason I was calling, I wanted to invite her to a lecture on campus by a Jewish believer in Jesus. And he said, and I myself am a Jewish believer in Jesus. And I just about dropped the phone. I'm like, here I'm talking about strange phone calls and Jews believing in Jesus. And who is this guy? So I said, all right, Lisa's not here, but I am. Tell me I'll go to this lecture. So I went. I met some other Jews who believe in Jesus, began to go to their Bible study on Saturday morning, began to go to their church. August 6, 1978, our church showed the film A Thief in the Night about the rapture. Scared me to death. After it was over, I turned to my friend Mike Barbalas. I said, Mike, when all this comes down, I want to be on the right side. Just pray with me. And I just prayed that I would be on God's side. And, and the Bible says whoever calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So that's all I knew. That's what I did. And after that, gradually I began to notice a change within me, a transformation that kept going. And that's how I got saved. That's my miracle.
It's good to have you with us here, and it's good to talk to you about the God Squad. And, there are some people who will hear that phrase and they'll immediately know what it is, right? For people who are sports fans, for people who have been following baseball maybe since the 70s, they'll be aware of that term. But for people who are not aware of what the God Squad is, tell us a little bit about that group of people and why that is so pivotal in Major League Baseball and specifically with the San Francisco Giants.
The Jesus Revolution really started in Southern California in the late 60s, early 70s. And young people in particular were getting swept up in the movement and becoming born again believers. And that kind of swept up the coast to Northern California. And it also swept into professional baseball. And there was one fellow in particular, Gary Lavelle, on the Giants, who got saved in winter ball in 1976. And then when he came back to the club in 77, he gradually began to share his faith with teammates, and many of them responded. And by 1978, not purely through Gary Lavelle, but by 78, there were, I count, 11 born-again Christians on a roster of 25 on the Giants. And what happened was in 78, they had a great comeback kind of a year. They had been pretty bad for several years. It was a highly successful season. Often the players would thank God afterward for the abilities he gave them, after the game, post-game interviews. And the press raised no objection because they were winning. So what could they say? But in 79, the Giants got off to a terrible start, and the local media decided to blame the born-again players. They said their faith had made them passive. They didn't care about winning. They just cared about Jesus. And somebody labeled them the God Squad. It was a pejorative. And so that became a theme which actually lasted until 1984 or early 85, by which time all of the God Squad had been traded away. Whether that was intentional or not, I don't know.
I'm 32, so I think one of the big things that comes to mind when I think about Christianity and sports overlapping is I think of Tim Tebow, right? That is just the first image that comes to mind. But this is a trend that far preceded Tim Tebow. It's something, as you said, in the 70s was present with the God Squad. Initially, it was something that was meant as a criticism, but became obviously to the people who were on the team a compliment. But talk a little bit about some of the inner workings there with the team, the players who were believers and the players who were not believers. How did they coexist with each other? How did that the faith aspect influence their camaraderie among each other?
There was one antagonistic columnist in particular, Glenn Dickey of the San Francisco Chronicle, who claimed that this was causing division and that the team should trade away some of these God Squatters because they had formed a clique. And there was another columnist named Lowell Cohn who was a satirist and would poke fun at the God Squad, but would not go to that extreme. And when I asked him how he felt about this being a clique, he said, look, players are allowed to hang out with the people that they like. It doesn't make it a clique. It's not a negative thing. And when I talked to Gary Lavelle about was there division, he said, no, not at all. He said they went to dinner with the non-believing players and their wives, and the press had created this story. One of the most ridiculous stories the press created was that there were 2 team buses when they took the team to the ballpark, one for the born-agains and one for the unbelievers. And it just wasn't true. But stories like that, see, the other thing with this, Trey, was these stories were generated in San Francisco and then picked up by national columnists like Dick Young of the New York Daily News and Peter Gammons of the Boston Globe. And nationally, these falsehoods were spread.
Talk about how maybe some of the societal pressure of the time was playing into how columnists and sports reporters may have been perceiving what the God Squad was actually like.
I think the thing that happened with the God Squad was these guys were not preaching generally. But I think the apprehension in the culture in San Francisco was that these guys were going to be judging the rest of us. There was some trepidation, I think, even among fans and readers, like, well, these guys are holier than thou. The fact is that they weren't. But the thing I want to point out is that the reason this was such a big deal, you mentioned Tim Tebow and others, I feel like the God Squad were spiritual pioneers in that they bore the brunt of criticism because in baseball, a little more history in baseball and Christianity, this was never done. There were, in the 50s and 60s, a handful of ball players who met in just before the games in what became baseball chapel on Sundays. But in terms of speaking out about their faith, it was extremely uncommon. And so when the God Squad did this in of all places, San Francisco, it was, it was like a tinderbox. Something was going to blow. And it did. It was like oil and water. These Christians trying to explain their faith to a culture that just didn't really get it.
Wow, fascinating stuff there. Really interesting. And if you want to see are we getting the full interview up onto YouTube here soon, Trey?
Yeah, we should have the full interview later this week.
All right.
All of it was really fascinating.
Yeah, sure. Looking forward to that for sure. It was fascinating to hear that part of it as well. So, all right, that's going to leave us with time on the pod for one last thing.
We're looking at Ephesians 2, 8, and 9 today. It says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." I think, especially after listening to that main thing there, this verse is a great reminder of the sufficiency of Christ to save us.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's not of our own works. No works that you can do are going to save you. Those are a result of our faith, not determinant of our faith. So great message, great verse to marinate on as always. So make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. And Lord willing, That creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back tomorrow with more. God bless. See you then.